There are good reasons to use frames, iframes and pop-ups, but you need to understand the problems from an SEO perspective. There are really two problems with these things. First, as we saw with PDF and Flash files in the previous video, files designed to be placed within frames can end up orphaned, appearing in the search results outside of the navigational context they were designed for. Secondly, each framed or pop-up page represents an opportunity cost. You're reducing the number of nicely optimized pages you'll have in your website. Frames allow web designers to put several pages into a web browser at the same time. One for a title bar, one for a navigation bar, one for content, for instance. Clicking an entry in the navbar frame could change the page in the content frame. They can be useful, but they cause problems from an SEO perspective. There are really two problems. First, framed pages can get orphaned, just as we saw Flash and PDF files being orphaned in the previous video. Each page is indexed separately, so if the page is found in the search engines, it won't be in the website. It will be separated from it. The title and description tags from the main site will be missing, though admittedly you can provide those separately for each internal page. Perhaps more importantly, the site navigation and site branding has gone. You can help the situation somewhat by, for example, adding navigation within all framed pages, so visitors can find their way from the orphan page to the main site. Of course, that starts to look somewhat clunky and rather defeats the object of framing. There are also some JavaScript techniques people sometimes use to force an orphaned page to load into its normal frame set. My attitude is, why mess around when you really don't need frames in most situations? How about iframes? These are internal or inline frames, documents that are framed directly inside another document. Again, they can be useful in some contexts, but search engines will index the inline framed document as a separate page. So again, you'll have the problem of orphaned pages. These documents will appear in the search engines without site navigation, outside of the context for which they were intended. Then there's the opportunity cost. Each iframed document could be a nicely optimized web page with a good keyworded URL, a nice title tag, H1 headings, and so on. But iframed documents are not going to be well optimized, and you don't really even want them to be well optimized because you don't really want them turning up in the search engines. After all, if you can get the page to turn up in the search engines, you want a page that isn't orphaned, one that is clearly part of your site and can lead people further into your site, rather than making visitors click the back button. How about pop-ups? I'm referring here to separate, usually small windows that open up when a link or button is clicked. They can be very useful for providing contextual information. You often see them triggered from little question mark buttons in forms, for instance. But when they're used to hold large amounts of useful content, text that could perform well in the search engines, they're a problem for the same two reasons. They'll be orphaned in the search engines, and they represent a loss of useful keyworded pages that could be found in the search engines. I'm not saying you shouldn't use these components, just that you should be aware of the problems they represent from a search engine perspective and consider alternatives. Personally, I would stay away from frames for areas of the site that you want the search engines to index. They're fine for private areas of the site. If you still want to use iframes and pop-ups, that's okay, but you may want to consider putting the content into a separate directory of your site, then using your robots.txt file to block that area. You might even use the content in two ways. Create your pop-ups and iframes. They can be a very convenient way to present information to users, but also have a series of pages in which you place the same content for the search engines to find.